The thought of spending my life with one person kind of scares me. I'm thinking I might want an open relationship.
Josh finally gave Catie the answer she probably never wanted to hear. Because if marrying her means accepting an open relationship, then maybe there should not be a wedding at all. And that one sentence suddenly makes every uncomfortable moment between them this season feel much more serious than it did before. This is a man who left his life in England, crossed an ocean, and built his future around one relationship. Yet only weeks before the wedding, he is hearing his fiancé question whether spending the rest of her life with only him is something she truly wants. And that is not the kind of disagreement you fix by picking a different venue or changing the wedding date. The bigger problem here is not simply whether Catie wants to be with other men, because the more important question is whether Catie and Josh have ever truly agreed on what marriage is supposed to mean for both of them. If you have watched their story carefully, this did not suddenly appear during one random conversation, because the warning signs have been building for a while, and nearly every major conflict between them has somehow returned to trust, boundaries, freedom, and what each person believes should be acceptable inside a committed relationship. Josh already watched Catie behave in ways around other men that made him uncomfortable, and after the birthday party situation, he was not only upset about what happened in that moment, because he was also questioning whether an apology really matters when the same type of problem keeps coming back in a slightly different form. That is where their relationship becomes more complicated than a normal reality television argument, because the issue is no longer one bad night or one poor decision, and it starts looking like two people trying to force very different ideas of commitment into the same relationship. Then came the bachelorette party conversation, where Catie openly talked about monogamy sounding boring to her, and admitted that the idea of being with one person for the rest of her life was something that scared her, while also recognizing that Josh probably wanted something very different. That admission matters because she was not speaking like someone who simply wanted one final night of freedom before getting married. And she was talking about the structure of the marriage itself, which is a much deeper issue than flirting at a party or getting carried away after drinking. When Josh finally responded by making his position clear and saying that he would not accept an open marriage, viewers understood exactly why he reached that point. Because from his perspective, he has already spent much of this relationship trying to explain where his boundaries are. A lot of people watching probably felt relieved when Josh finally stopped negotiating and made his limit clear. Because there comes a point where constantly explaining the same boundary starts making the person setting it feel like they are asking for permission to have standards. Still, I do not think Josh saying no to an open marriage actually solves their relationship problem. Because all it really does is remove one option from the table, while the much bigger question about what Catie genuinely wants remains completely unresolved. Josh has answered his side very clearly, because he wants a monogamous marriage. But Catie has not really answered whether she genuinely wants the same thing, or whether she is simply willing to accept it, because losing Josh would be worse. Those two things can look exactly the same during a wedding ceremony, but they can feel completely different 6 months or 2 years into a marriage. That is why the timing of Catie bringing this up matters so much. Because by the time her bachelorette party arrived, she already knew how Josh felt about her behavior with other men, and she already knew these issues had hurt him before. She had already experienced arguments over boundaries, she had already apologized after situations involving other people, and she had already watched Josh become frustrated and emotionally exhausted by the same general problem. Knowing all of that, she still raised the possibility that monogamy itself might not work for her. And that tells me the conversation was probably about something deeper than one impulsive thought. People are allowed to want non-monogamous relationships, and there is nothing automatically dishonest or selfish about wanting a relationship that works differently from a traditional marriage. But that type of relationship only works when both people genuinely want it. You cannot build a healthy open relationship by convincing someone who clearly wants exclusivity that they should accept something that makes them uncomfortable. Just like you cannot build a healthy monogamous relationship by forcing someone who deeply resents exclusivity to pretend that they are happy with it. That is the real issue with Josh and Catie, because neither person necessarily needs to be the villain for them to be fundamentally incompatible. Josh seems to look at commitment through the idea of exclusivity, trust, and clearly defined boundaries, while Catie appears to place more value on freedom, excitement, and the ability to explore feelings or experiences that do not fit inside Josh's version of marriage. Neither belief automatically makes someone terrible, but trying to combine both without real agreement can create a relationship where somebody is always sacrificing something they consider essential. The pattern between them makes this even more concerning, because their conflicts do not seem to reach real resolution, and they often follow the same basic cycle. A boundary gets established, something happens that pushes or crosses that boundary, Josh becomes upset, Catie apologizes, the immediate tension eventually disappears, and then the deeper disagreement underneath the incident remains untouched until another situation brings it back. That is not really solving conflict, because it is only managing the emotional damage after each new incident. The birthday party situation looked like one problem, the bachelorette conversation looked like another problem, and the open marriage argument looked like a third problem, but when you connect them together, they all appear to come from the same disagreement. Josh believes the rules of the relationship are already understood, while Catie keeps acting or speaking in ways that suggest she may not actually agree with those rules as strongly as he does. That difference matters because Josh's approach throughout the season has mostly been about trying to change specific behavior. He wants Catie to stop crossing lines with other men, stop putting him in situations where he feels embarrassed or disrespected, and stop repeating behavior that she already knows hurts him. Catie's approach seems very different, because instead of only changing her behavior inside the relationship, she sometimes appears to question whether the expectations themselves should change. If monogamy keeps creating conflict, her instinct seems to be asking whether monogamy is the right structure for her at all. That means Josh is trying to protect the rules, while Catie appears to be questioning the rules, and those two people are not even solving the same problem. Josh wants different behavior from Catie, while Catie seems to want more freedom from the expectations Josh considers necessary. There is no simple compromise between those positions, because some relationship issues allow both people to meet in the middle, while others eventually require someone to give up something they deeply value. You can compromise on where to live, how much money to spend on a wedding, which family to visit during the holidays, or how often you travel. But exclusivity is harder because there is no obvious halfway point when one partner wants complete monogamy and the other feels restricted by it. That is why I think people focusing only on whether Catie behaved badly are missing the more important relationship question. The real issue is not whether Josh can convince Catie to behave differently for a few weeks, because the real issue is whether Catie believes in the same relationship structure he does when nobody is watching, and there is no wedding deadline forcing a decision. A wedding creates pressure to solve disagreements quickly because deposits are paid, families are involved, plans are already made, and emotionally it can feel impossible to walk away after investing so much time. That pressure can make people confuse agreement with compatibility. Someone can say yes because they are afraid of losing the relationship, while privately still believing the thing they agreed to will eventually make them unhappy. If Catie eventually tells Josh that she accepts monogamy, the most important question will not be whether she says the words, because it will be whether that decision represents what she truly wants. If she chooses monogamy because she genuinely decides that building a life with Josh matters more to her than the freedom she was questioning, then there is at least a foundation they can work with. If she chooses monogamy only because Josh made it the price of getting married, then the conflict has not disappeared, and it has only become resentment waiting for another opportunity to surface. That difference is why Josh's ultimatum feels satisfying in the moment, but still leaves their future uncertain. Viewers often want a clear winner during these arguments, because reality television encourages us to decide who is right and who is wrong. But real relationships are usually more complicated than that. Josh has every right to say he will not marry someone under conditions that make him uncomfortable. And Catie also has the right to admit if lifelong monogamy genuinely does not fit what she wants. The unhealthy part would be either person pretending to want something they do not want simply because they are scared of ending the relationship. That is also why their repeated arguments around alcohol and parties matter beyond the individual incidents. Because alcohol may lower someone's judgment, but it does not automatically create beliefs or desires that were never there. When similar behavior keeps appearing in the same environment, eventually the couple has to stop treating the environment as the entire explanation and start asking what the behavior is revealing. Josh cannot spend the rest of a marriage wondering whether every party will turn into another test of his boundaries, because that creates constant anxiety. Catie cannot spend the rest of a marriage feeling that she has to monitor every interaction, because Josh will interpret normal social behavior as a threat, because that creates resentment in the opposite direction. They have to agree on what the line actually is, and more importantly, they both have to believe that line is fair. That agreement does not seem fully established right now. There is also another side of this conversation that deserves attention, because the focus is usually placed entirely on Josh's feelings whenever Catie approaches another man. but the other people involved also have boundaries and the right to feel comfortable with whatever is happening. Consent does not become less important because someone is at a party, drinking, filming a television show, or joking around with friends. That does not automatically mean every interaction this season should be interpreted in the harshest possible way, but it does mean viewers are reasonable to pay attention when physical boundaries become part of the storyline. That adds another reason why simply saying, "Catie was drunk," does not completely close the conversation. Josh also seems exhausted by the repetition, and that emotional exhaustion can sometimes be more damaging than the original incident. When someone repeatedly feels they have to explain the same boundary, they eventually stop arguing because they believe the other person does not understand, and they start arguing because they believe the other person understands perfectly well, but simply does not care enough to respect it. Once a relationship reaches that point, every new incident carries the weight of all the previous ones. That is why one kiss can suddenly turn into an argument about the entire relationship, because the argument is never really about only the kiss anymore. It becomes about promises, trust, memory, effort, and whether someone's words can still be believed. Catie may see each situation as separate, but Josh appears to see them as evidence of a larger pattern. And those different interpretations are another reason they keep talking past each other. Catie can apologize for one specific moment, while Josh is asking for reassurance about the entire future. If she says, "I am sorry about what happened tonight," that may answer what she did, but it does not answer what he really wants to know, which is whether he will be dealing with the same issue after they are married. That is exactly why the open marriage conversation feels like such a major turning point. It takes everything Josh may have feared privately and brings it into the open. Instead of worrying only about whether Catie will cross a boundary again, he is now hearing that she may not completely believe in the boundary itself. That changes everything. If someone breaks a rule they believe in, they can apologize and work on their behavior. If someone does not believe the rule should exist, then constantly asking them to follow it creates a very different kind of relationship. That is where Josh and Catie seem stuck. Josh is trying to create security by making the boundary stronger, while Catie may be trying to create comfort by making the boundary less restrictive. The more Josh tightens the rules, the more trapped Catie could feel, and the more Catie pushes for freedom, the less secure Josh could feel. If neither person changes how they see the relationship, they could easily create a cycle where each person's attempt to feel better makes the other person feel worse. That kind of cycle rarely disappears because of a wedding. In fact, marriage can make it more intense, because once the ceremony is over, the fantasy of everything will settle down afterward disappears. There is no longer a wedding date to focus on, and all the unresolved issues are still sitting inside the same house. That is one reason reality television couples sometimes appear happier during wedding planning than they do after the wedding, because planning gives them a common goal. The ceremony becomes the mission, and every disagreement gets pushed aside because everyone wants to reach the finish line. Once they reach it, they discover that the finish line was actually the starting point. Josh and Catie should be asking themselves what happens after the cameras are gone, the parties stop, and the wedding excitement fades. If Catie feels bored by monogamy now, what happens when married life becomes routine? If Josh struggles to trust her now, what happens when he cannot see every interaction she has? Those are not accusations about what either person will definitely do, because nobody knows their future, but they are reasonable questions based on the problems they are already discussing. Another issue sitting quietly behind this relationship is the fact that they seem to have differences beyond only physical boundaries. They have also had larger questions around values, religion, and what their future family could look like. When couples disagree on one major value, they can sometimes work through it with enough patience and communication. When several major values are unresolved at the same time, every disagreement becomes connected to the others. The argument stops being only about one night or one decision, and each person starts wondering whether they chose someone who actually wants a completely different life. That is where love alone can become dangerous as a decision-making tool. You can deeply love someone who is not compatible with the life you need. Josh can love Catie and still decide that he cannot live in a relationship where exclusivity is constantly being questioned. Catie can love Josh and still decide that she does not want a marriage where she feels restricted or bored. Ending a relationship for that reason would be painful, but it would still be more honest than marrying while secretly hoping the other person changes afterward. That is why I think Josh's strongest moment was not necessarily the fact that he rejected the open marriage idea. The stronger part was that he finally made his standard clear without leaving room for endless negotiation. He He basically told Catie that she has the freedom to want whatever relationship she wants, but he also has the freedom to refuse to participate in it. That is what a real boundary looks like. A boundary is not telling another adult what they are allowed to want. It is deciding what you will personally accept. The question now is whether Catie responds with the same level of honesty. If she truly wants a different relationship structure, then the mature decision would be saying that clearly before the wedding. If she genuinely decides that monogamy with Josh is what she wants, then the next step is showing that choice consistently instead of only promising it during moments of conflict. That is where this relationship becomes interesting going forward, because words are no longer enough. Josh has already heard apologies, he has already heard explanations, he has already experienced temporary peace after arguments. What he probably needs now is consistency. Consistency is boring television, but it is exactly what healthy trust requires. You do not rebuild trust with one emotional conversation. You rebuild it when the same situation comes around again and the person chooses differently without needing another argument first. If Catie wants Josh to believe that monogamy is something she can genuinely commit to, that proof will come through behavior over time, not through one promise before the wedding. The same responsibility also exists for Josh. Because if Catie does commit to his boundary and follows through, he cannot keep punishing her forever for old mistakes. Trust cannot recover if one person changes while the other keeps using the past as evidence that change is impossible. That means both of them would need to do something difficult. Catie would need to become more consistent with the boundaries they agree on, and Josh would eventually need to allow that consistency to rebuild his confidence instead of constantly expecting the next failure. Whether they can actually do that is still unclear. Looking ahead, the first likely outcome is that Josh continues refusing any form of open marriage. Nothing we have seen suggests that he secretly wants this arrangement, and his reaction seems connected to a much deeper belief about what commitment should look like. I do not expect him to suddenly reverse that position simply because the wedding is approaching. If anything, the closer the wedding gets, the more important that boundary probably becomes for him. The second possible outcome is that Catie agrees to monogamy because she wants to save the relationship. That could sound like good news, but I would be careful before calling it a resolution. If she agrees because she truly wants that life with Josh, then they have something real to work with. If she agrees because she feels pressured by the wedding, by family, by public reaction, or by fear of losing Josh, the agreement may only move the conflict deeper underground. Pressure can produce obedience, but it does not always produce acceptance. A person can follow a rule while quietly resenting it, and resentment usually finds another way to come out. Maybe it appears through more arguments about flirting. Maybe it appears through complaints that the relationship is boring. Maybe it becomes emotional distance. Maybe the couple starts fighting about completely unrelated things because the real issue is too uncomfortable to say directly. That is why getting the wedding back on track should not be their only goal. Their real goal should be making sure they are choosing the same marriage. The third possibility is that they marry, and this entire disagreement becomes a major issue again later. That would not surprise me at all, because a ring does not rewrite someone's values. If Catie genuinely has a strong desire for novelty or freedom outside traditional monogamy, marriage will not automatically switch that desire off. If Josh genuinely needs exclusivity and predictability to feel secure, marriage will not automatically make him more comfortable with blurred boundaries. All marriage does is raise the cost of discovering that those differences cannot be resolved. Then there is the tell-all, and while this is only a prediction, I would be surprised if the open marriage conversation did not become one of the main topics. It has created too much reaction, and it connects too many earlier moments from their storyline. The obvious questions are already there. Does Catie still believe monogamy is boring? Does she still want an open relationship? Does Josh trust her now? Did they establish new boundaries? Was the bachelorette conversation something she truly believed? Or was she speaking impulsively in the moment? Those are the questions viewers will want answered because the wedding itself cannot answer them. Even if they appear together and say everything is great, people will still be watching their body language and listening carefully to whether both of them describe the relationship the same way. That is another problem when trust issues play out publicly. Once viewers notice a pattern, every later interaction gets interpreted through that pattern. A normal disagreement becomes evidence of a breakup. A social media post becomes evidence of cheating. A missing ring becomes evidence of divorce. Most of those theories should never be treated as fact without reliable confirmation. There have been online discussions and possible clues about whether Catie and Josh may have moved forward with the marriage, but unless their current relationship status is confirmed through reliable information. The responsible answer is that we do not know exactly where they stand now. Reality television fans are very good at finding clues, but clues are still not confirmation. A photograph can be old, a ring can mean nothing. A filming schedule can hide the real timeline. That is why speculation should stay speculation until something stronger appears. Even if they did get married, though, I would not automatically treat that as proof that everything was resolved. Couples get married with unresolved issues all the time. Sometimes they work through them later. Sometimes the wedding only delays the breakup. The meaningful question is not whether Josh and Catie reached the altar. The meaningful question is whether they reached a real agreement. That brings everything back to the moment Josh drew his line. No open marriage means no wedding. It sounds like an ending, but it is really the beginning of the most important decision in their relationship. Josh has decided what he cannot accept. Now Catie has to decide what she actually wants. Not what she wants during one emotional conversation. Not what she says because the wedding is close. Not what sounds best when everyone around her is listening. She has to decide what kind of relationship she can genuinely live inside for years. If lifelong monogamy honestly feels wrong to her, then marrying Josh while hoping that feeling disappears would be unfair to both of them. Josh would enter the marriage believing the issue had been settled, while Catie could enter it feeling like she sacrificed an important part of herself just to keep the relationship alive. That is how resentment starts. On the other hand, people can change their views about relationships as they mature, fall deeper in love, or understand what commitment means to them. It is possible that Catie's fears about monogamy are connected to anxiety about marriage rather than a permanent desire for an open relationship. It is possible that she is questioning what lifelong commitment means because the wedding suddenly makes everything feel real. That is why I would not automatically say that her doubts prove she can never be monogamous. The important thing is whether she understands the difference between temporary fear and a fundamental need. If she is only nervous about losing freedom because marriage feels permanent, that is something they can talk through. If she truly believes exclusivity will make her unhappy, then no amount of wedding planning can solve it. Josh also needs to ask himself a difficult question. Does he want Catie as she actually is, or does he want the version of Catie he believes will exist after marriage? That distinction matters because people sometimes marry potential instead of reality. They focus on who their partner might become once they settle down, stop partying, move countries, start a family, or leave television behind. Then they feel betrayed when the person remains exactly who they were before the wedding. If Josh needs Catie to become fundamentally different before the marriage can feel safe, that is a warning sign by itself. The same applies to Catie. If she needs Josh to become more relaxed about boundaries after marriage, even though he has repeatedly shown that exclusivity matters deeply to him, then she may also be marrying a future version of Josh that does not exist. Healthy commitment requires accepting the person in front of you, not signing a contract with the person you hope they become later. That is why this storyline feels more serious than the usual 90-day fiancé party drama. The parties are only where the problem becomes visible. The real conflict is about identity. Who is Catie inside a committed relationship? What does Josh need from a wife? What does Catie need from a husband? What does loyalty mean to each of them? What behavior counts as harmless fun? And what behavior feels like betrayal? Those questions should have been answered long before the wedding countdown became this serious. Instead, they are still negotiating them while everyone is preparing for a ceremony that is supposed to represent permanent commitment. That is exactly why viewers are nervous. People can forgive mistakes, they can rebuild after bad nights, they can recover from embarrassing moments. What is harder to recover from is discovering that you and your partner were never working from the same definition of marriage. If Josh believes marriage means two people choosing each other exclusively, and Catie believes marriage should still leave room for romantic or sexual freedom, then neither person can simply apologize their way out of that difference. One of them eventually has to change what they want, or both of them have to admit the relationship may not work. That choice is painful, but pretending the choice does not exist would be worse. The strongest thing Josh can do now is continue being clear without turning his boundary into punishment or control. The strongest thing Catie can do is answer him honestly without saying whatever keeps the wedding alive for another week. If she wants monogamy, then she should choose it because it feels right for her relationship. If she does not want monogamy, then she should say that before marriage makes the situation harder. That is the conversation I think matters more than any dramatic scene we have watched this season. A wedding should not be used as a deadline that forces compatibility. It should happen after compatibility is already clear enough that both people understand what they are promising. Right now, Josh knows what he is promising. He is promising exclusivity. The unanswered question is whether Catie is making the same promise from conviction or only from fear of losing him. That one difference could decide everything that happens next. If she genuinely chooses the same life he wants, then maybe this entire conflict becomes the painful conversation they needed before marriage. If she only agrees because the alternative is losing Josh, then I would expect the problem to return eventually. Because feelings pushed down under pressure rarely disappear permanently. Maybe it happens during another party. Maybe it becomes the biggest argument at the tell-all. Maybe it comes back months after the wedding when the cameras are gone. Nobody can say for certain. What we can say is that this issue is too fundamental to ignore. Josh finally made his position clear, and now Catie has to decide whether she truly wants the marriage he is offering. Because love may be keeping them together right now, but love cannot permanently solve a disagreement about the basic rules of the relationship. That is the real question hanging over their future. If Catie honestly believes monogamy is not right for her, should Josh walk away before the wedding instead of hoping marriage changes her mind? Or do you believe Catie can genuinely choose commitment and build the kind of marriage Josh wants after everything they have already been through?